My name is John Passfield, and the title of this reading will be John and Dickens, Video 28, Critical Quotations 2. Excuse me. So here's my novella, John and Dickens, A Christmas Mystery. Picture on the front of John meeting Dickens in his writing room. Dickens and the pre-Christmas Carol characters are there, and John gets to speak to them and listen to them. Writer John Passfield leaves his home, buys a coffee, and drives down to the shores of Lake Erie to perform a Christmas ritual, strolling along the beach at Port Maitland. It's something he's done for many years, but this year's different. This year, John suddenly finds himself in the writing room of famed Victorian novelist Charles Dickens, who sets out his new idea for a Christmas carol. So this is 1843. Dickens invites John to watch rehearsals for the writing of the story, but as Dickens struggles through contentious negotiations with the amazingly independent characters, John wonders whether a Christmas carol will ever be written. Now, in a previous video, I said that the critical quotations which are included in the text of the novella are images in the mind of John the character. Of course, Dickens would not know of these quotations, as he would not know in the earlier chapters of the novella that he will never go on to write a Canadian novel. So, who in this novella, Dickens in 1843, knowing only that about his life, and John in the 21st century, who in this novella knows more about the books of Charles Dickens in relation to his life, the character Charles Dickens or the character John? Here are more of the quotations that John thinks about as he goes through the experience of meeting Dickens and accompanying him through the challenges of the Dickens writing process. Okay, so quotations in the mind of John, looking for page 59, which are acting as imagery that helps to illuminate events, characters and events. So how is this imagery helping him to understand this Dickens experience that he's going through? Here's the first one. Dickens is by far his own best critic. Now that's a 21st century critic speaking about Dickens, having read his books. How Dickens is by far his own best critic. Dickens has written that by the intensity of his imagination, he is able to perceive relations in things which are not generally apparent. So that seems to be in praise of Dickens, page 59. Let's go to page 63. Is this in praise of Dickens, I wonder? Number one, no novelist has profited more richly than Dickens from not examining what goes on in his own mind. The second one, Dickens is not able and not willing to analyze the relations between the inner being of his characters and their outer selves. So maybe these two sets of critics, the first two passages I read and the second two, disagree. Dickens was a smart cookie. He could see and understand. Dickens was a great writer, but he didn't have a clue what he was writing in terms of meaning. Let's go on. Page 69. Two more quotes. Images in the mind of John. Trying to use them as candles, searchlights, spotlights to understand what he's seeing when he interacts with Dickens. Dickens uses the materials of the popular literature and culture of his childhood, such as pantomime and romance. Number two, he brings the weight of mature awareness to the old forms of the folk tale and the fairy tale. Okay, that was 69. Let's go to 72. Here we are for two more quotations about Dickens. Number one, a Dickens character's intent on creating an identity in a world of dizzying circumstances. Creating an identity. Number two, a Dickens character is as much a creative artist as Dickens himself, as the Dickens character must create an imaginary person in order to define and celebrate the self. So we create an imaginary person, and then we ask ourselves, well, is that me? So anyway, let's go on. From 72 to 79, here we are. Two quotations again. As Dickens' novel shows us that life is not a straight path, but a series of crossroads. Number 2, Dickens' novel presents an imagined metaphorical world which stands as a model by which to explore the realities of actual life. So a model by which we explore the realities. Okay. From 79 to 83. Here we are. 2 more quotations. The truths of a Dickens novel cannot be appreciated from the outside. The reader must participate in a Dickens novel in order to appreciate that there is any truth at all. There's the word participate. You must participate in a Dickens novel. You must participate in any work of art. So that theory goes. 89. Okay, page 89, 2 more quotations. In reading a Dickens novel, we feel the presence of the novelist, of his disciplined magisterial sensibility. Second quotation, Dickens, the narrator, acts as a kind of deity, God, small letter G, G-O-D, a deity. Dickens, the narrator, acts as a kind of deity, creating and controlling the experience that he imposes upon his readers. So that's 89. I'll just read one more in this presentation. Page 92, and here it is. 2 more, actually, but one more segment with 2 items. Number 1, the variety of modes in the presentation of a Dickens narrative makes his novels akin to the poetic drama. Variety of modes, techniques, poetic drama. Complexity of presentation is the wall that Dickens has built between himself and the darkest days of his existence. Complexity of presentation is the wall that Dickens has built between himself and the darkest days of his existence. Okay, here is a note that I will read. As I mentioned in an earlier video, I did not have John the character comment on the quotations from critics that are operating as a layer of imagery in his mind as he goes through the experience of meeting Dickens and watching the writer interact with his Christmas Carol characters. What I did do was to print the same quotations in my book, The Poetic Novel 2. I'll just hold it up for a sec. It's a manuscript. It's not yet posted on my website. It will be within a few months of November 2023. I might add a few more essays, polish it a bit, and then have it posted. Okay, so I'll just read that sentence again. What I did do was to print the same quotations in my book, The Poetic Novel 2, which is, as of this month, November 2023, still not ready for posting on my website. Here are 2 more of the quotations and the responses of myself, John the writer, to them. Okay. So this quotation is from Kathleen Tillotson, a 20th century, 21st century critic of Dickens. Here's her words. The variety of modes in the presentation of a Dickens narrative makes his novels akin to the poetic drama. And here's the response of myself, John the writer, in the book The Poetic Novel 2. An interesting thing happened to me during the process of writing of my novella, John and Dickens, A Christmas Mystery. So I was writing the planning notebook, which starts before the full-time writing of the novella. I was intrigued by, but baffled by, my early interest in Dickens. I had read about 6 of the Dickens novels during the year in which I was 23 years old. Now I'm 78 as I'm sitting here reading this note. So I was 23 years old and I read 6 Dickens novels. And I wasn't sure why a couple of months ago when I was writing the planning notebook, but I think I know now. At the same time, I was reading biography and criticism of Dickens and continued to do so over the years, often dipping into biographies and reading essays on Dickens as part of my lifelong interest in the nature of literature and how it works to generate potential meaning in the mind of a reader. It was only late in the writing of my Dickens novella, perhaps not even until I was writing the John and Dickens journal, that is while polishing the novella, that I realized that one aspect of my early interest in Dickens was this, okay? So I write the novella about Dickens. All the time I think, I wonder why I was so interested in Dickens when I was 23 years old. And then it hit me. Oh, I know what it was. Here it is. Okay, these are in dashes, but there's 6 points, so I'll number them. Number 1, that Shakespeare wrote great literature. Number 2, that T.S. Eliot coined the term objective correlative to explain the literary image pattern that we have within the covers of a book. He simply pointed out that this is the image pattern that is dredged up by the creative writer from the depths of his or her subconscious creative mind. Number 3, that Shakespeare has left us with 37 objective correlatives, but has left us with almost nothing in terms of biography that we can look at in order to see what in his surface life, his everyday life, led him to choose the imagery of the 37 great works of literary art. Number 4, that Dickens is one of the few writers who can be put in a category with Shakespeare for high-level literary achievement. Number 5, that we can see the Dickens novels as objective correlatives of a very highly complex order of literary art, but here's the difference between Shakespeare and Dickens. 6, unlike Shakespeare, Dickens has left behind a fairly complete biography of his everyday life. So, it is possible for us, we readers, to move back and forth between the objective correlatives that he created as a response to that everyday life and the everyday experiences of that life itself, okay? So for Dickens, books and biography, for Shakespeare, books, but very little by way of biography. So even though I'll go on to say I was interested in Shakespeare and the poetic play, something drew me to Dickens, his books, his biography. So that explanation struck me as a clear indication of why, when I had set off on the study of the poetic plays of Shakespeare and the ancient Greeks, I became so interested in Dickens all of a sudden and spent what I'm sure was a very busy year in my own surface life, a new job, a new wife, a whole new lifestyle at that time, to read quite extensively in the novels, biographies, and criticism of Dickens. Only recently, though, have I been able to realize consciously that the complexity of Dickens's novels means that he was straining at the bounds of the form of the realist novel. The reason that Dickens was often criticized during the late 19th century and into the 20th century for failing to adhere to the rules of that particular form, in effect for failing to write satisfactory realist novels, was that Dickens was one of those writers, along with Emily Bronte, Henry James, and Joseph Conrad in the early days, and later, the modernists such as Virginia Woolf and Marcel Proust, who found that the realist novel was just not able to carry the freight of potential meaning, the breadth and depth of complexity that the complexity of the lives that they and their fellows were living demanded in a work of literary art, which purported to be a legitimate response to those lives, but wasn't doing the job. So yes, Dickens writes novels which, by the variety of modes, here's the quote again, in the presentation makes his novels akin to the poetic novel. That's Kathleen Tillotson saying that. The variety of modes, techniques, in the presentation makes his novels akin to the poetic drama. Back to me again. The pre-modernist writers and the modernist writers realized that we humans are always thinking of ourselves from as many possible points of view as we possibly can. They realized that the prose novel simplified that process to a backward look, past action, now completed, now it can be told story, which skewed, even obliterated, the process whereby we think about life as we experience life, not when we reach a point where we can think without being burdened with the need to decide and to act. They realize that there is no such thing as the thinking present and the action past. There is only the past is present is past need to think and act at all times in order to achieve some measure of potential meaning in both the present moment and in the entire lifetime of experience, not only of oneself, but of one's fellows in the entire history of the planet and in the ever-present cosmic surround in which we breathe, think, and act. The desire to write about life as it is actually lived explains why writers like Dickens didn't write typical prose novels and explains why people like Virginia Woolf and others broke away from the typical prose novel form in an attempt to invent some other kind of novel. The artistic problem was always the same. The artistic solution was one of searching, with sometimes greater and sometimes lesser success, at finding a suitable literary form. Okay, now, here's another quotation, this time from the critic Stephen, maybe, Stephen, Marcus, Marcus. So here's his quotation. A Dickens novel makes an unrelenting demand on the reader's attention. A Dickens novel makes an unrelenting demand on reader's attention. Okay, now to my response as John the writer. It sometimes seems as if the 20th century invented the idea of a close reading of a poem, a play, or a novel. This seems to me to parallel the realization that Shakespeare had much more going on in his plays than simply character, setting, and action. It was the poets of the nature of Eliot and Pound who set the tone for a close reading of a very short lyrical poem, which would yield great treasures of reading response if one paid close attention, not only to every word, but the interactions of the imagery on the page. When we come to Dylan Thomas, many people on first seeing his poems thought they couldn't be read, that they weren't even written in English, that they were probably translations from ancient Welsh, which sounded beautiful on the page, but had no logic. Well, one could say that the poems have no apparent surface logic, but when you think of how Dylan Thomas himself explained the process by which he wrote his poems, now expected them to be read, then you realize that an image begets an image, not by surface logic connection, but by thematic logic connection. I would say by thematic potential logic connection. So a cluster of images is built around a topic. The death of a child during an air raid during the Second World War, for instance, and if one reads closely, constantly asking himself what potentially thematic logic connection there could be in terms of parallels and contrasts, attractions and repulsions in the relationship of image to image, one can read a Dylan Thomas poem. And this is the process whereby one is being asked to read the modernist novel. So 2 dashes here. I'll number them. 1. There's more surface logic connection available in a modernist novel than there is in a Dylan Thomas poem, but a lot less than there is in a realist novel. And number 2, there's as much subsurface thematic potential logic in a modernist novel as there is in a Dylan Thomas poem, and a lot more, infinitely more, than is available in a realist novel. So there's surface, which the realist novel gives us in plenty, and there's depth, which the realist novel doesn't have a lot of. Well, it turned out that close reading was not new to the 20th century in terms of possibility of the reading response to a work of literary art. Simply a case of the great readers of Shakespeare, the Dr. Johnsons, the Coleridges, and the Bradleys, didn't realize that one could read Shakespeare so closely, with particular attention to imagery, not ignoring character and setting and plot, but seeing the imagery as the illuminator of character, setting, and plot. The Shakespeare plays did not become more poetic over the centuries. The readers improved in their image reading skills by learning from earlier readers. So the text of Shakespeare didn't change. We just learned to go deeper into it as readers. So looking back, one can say that close reading has always been a possibility in earlier literature, but it just hadn't been done. At least it hadn't been done enough to have turned up in the early criticism that was written about Shakespeare. My great discovery, not a discovery at all, as has been known to every writer of serious literature before my time, but my own realization about the nature of literature and how imagery works to generate potential meaning in the mind of a reader, is that serious literature, no matter how clear or how obscure the surface, has splits in the surface story which allow for the interpolation of deepening imagery. The deepening imagery suggests themes that can then be seen to run through all the seemingly informational elements of the story. The informational elements of a story can then be seen to be imagery elements in the story. In turn, the deepening imagery makes the surface information itself into deepening imagery. That is why we can say that there's nothing in the play Hamlet, no item of information that is not, potentially at least, depending on the sensibility of the reader, an image, right? Something very simple in Hamlet. I'll lug the guts into the neighbor room. Don't just think of it as information only. Think of it as imagery. It's resonating with all of the other information in the play to create imagery. Okay, so once again, here is my novella, John and Dickens, A Christmas Mystery, a novella by John Passfield. It's found on Amazon. It's found at my publisher's website, Rocks Mills Press. It's found on my website in terms of information at johnpassfield.ca, where you'll find a planning notebook and a reflective journal for free access. Just click on the covers, click on the icons, and the text will appear on the screen. You can have a look at what I think as I plan and write the novel, and then as I polished the novella, sorry, not a novel, but a novella, before I send it to my publisher. Lastly, thank you for watching this video.